Good evening. My name is Madeline Spencer, and I'm here with Placemaking US tonight, and we have a wonderful group of panelists, and I just want to quickly frame for you. We brought you together this evening with a cemetery talk, race and place, and one of the questions that we were asking at the beginning is, how do we as placemakers, place keepers, help people to create and preserve places and help them to remember what could otherwise be forgotten? Um, with so many recent memorials, monuments, murals, flags, statue removals across the country and around the world, we thought it's a really good time for placemakers to look very candidly at what it means to discuss memory and place. The image of the cemetery was chosen as example because it's often one of the best preserved green spaces in modern cities, yet cultural norms in the United States prevent many of us from using these potentials as public spaces that respect the memory of those who have passed. And it was very nice to have met with this panel a little bit before, and there were so many different questions that came up. And tonight, before starting, I wanted to just begin by sharing with you a little bit about each of our panelists, and then we're going to go through and have each of them share a little bit with you about their work. So to begin with, we have Tim Sorens, who is in South Park, Seattle, Washington, and he's a part of the Parish Collective. He is a pastor, a social entrepreneur, and the co-founding director of the Parish Collective. He convenes ministry leaders, teaches and consults with organizations and who seek human flourishing in particular neighborhoods. Next, we have Alex Sasyama from Los Angeles, California, who is in NeighborWorks America. Alex is a relationship manager for NeighborWorks and partners with community-based organizations on affordable housing and community development efforts throughout the county. We also have tonight with us Gordon Lee. Gordon Lee is in Oahu, Hawaii, and he is a JD, psychologist and public health practitioner. Gordon Lee was born and raised in Honolulu, Hawaii, and he became involved in Asian American movement in the spring of 1970s when students in Columbia took over Kent Hall. He he's a PhD in depth psychology at Pacifica Institute in Santa Barbara, California, and he has worked on excavating memory, reconstructing narrative, and with the Nikkei diaspora and the transnational experience from 1868 to 1941. We also have with us this evening Candace G, and she is an assistant planner at M Group. Candace is an urban planner, a journalist, and a creative strategist. She has a broad geographical spectrum of planning services to her credit, having studied and worked in Germany, China, Cambodia, and the United States. And her stateside experience includes projects on the East Coast and the San Francisco Bay Area. We also have with us Trinh Mai, who is a Vietnamese American artist. Trinh is second generation Vietnamese American visual artist who examines the refugee and immigrant experience then and now. And through a vast breadth of media, she helps tell stories of we, the enduring people, while focusing on our witnessing of war and wounds we've survived, our collective need to heal, and the long-suffering hope that carries us through deep waters and the custodial responsibility to which we are heirs. I believe that is everyone that we've gone through. So now I'd love to go to each of you and have you share a little bit more about your work. And we'll just start in line. I see you each on the screen, so we can start with you, Alex. Oops, you are on mute. Here we go.
Oh, hi everyone. Do you see
Hi.
my slide? No, you don't. Now, do you see my slide?
Yes.
Okay. Bear with me, everyone. I've got a lot of thoughts here and trying to piece it together. Hi again. I'm Alex Sasayama with NeighborWorks America. I work in community development. And I'm not going to really present on my work per se. This is more my personal experience and my relationship to this topic. We're clearly surrounded by death at this moment. This is more important than ever. And like many things, the pandemic hasn't really brought on anything new, but accelerated changes that were already taking place and made some things much more difficult to ignore. People were already dying. I think now just a lot more people are dying and a lot faster. This is, I think it's important to acknowledge that we all have specific experiences with loss, and that the places where we lay our people to rest. My father, for example, is buried both in San Pedro, California, a suburb of LA, and the farming village of Kikugawa outside of Shimonoseki, Japan, where he was from. My father's memorial service was in a Mormon chapel in San Diego, and my family, at least here in California, has no specific traditions around memorials and burials or visiting grave sites. And so each story is specific, and we should never make assumptions about individual practices, let alone entire cultures. Soon after my father's death, I read this book called The American Way of Death by Jessica Midford, and it's an expose, kind of a consumer expose on the death care industry. And it's there that I learned that it was only recently in history that we weren't no longer allowed to bury people in our own backyard, and how so many practices in this country are driven by an industry driven by profit. And while individual lots are sold like real estate, that as a whole, these cemeteries are privately owned and controlled. To me, this is important because making place happens within the context of the relationship we have with it, and that the dynamics of power, ownership, control are central considerations that we have to be aware of when we discuss these things. And it goes without saying that there's a long history of discrimination around, where people are buried, who gets to be buried, and there are even cemeteries that have disappeared. I think maybe instead of race and place, this really should be about racism and place, and maybe even throw in capitalism for good measure. Years ago, I lived in Oaxaca and was first exposed to the traditions there around Dia de los Muertos. They've become more popular here in the United States. This is Hollywood Forever, a cemetery in Los Angeles, a private cemetery that has put on large Day of the Dead events for several years that I have helped out on a few occasions. And is reinventing what a cemetery can look like, and that it's not just a place for mourning, but a place for concerts, for movies, and for events like this. There are things that give me pause, though, about the way we're embracing this tradition here in this country. I do have concerns around appropriation, around the commercialization of it. Cocoa is a good example. While it was factually correct in many ways, it's still, a movie making profit off of this tradition. But more than that, I'm concerned that we're focused on the fun part of it and ignoring that there's a whole culture around mourning that's not just about, drinking in a cemetery, that there is a process of mourning. And I think as we look at cemeteries, we shouldn't just seek to, quote, bring them to life, which is often the mantra when we talk about placemaking, but also explore what it means, for example, to be with death in them. And last, I want to say that we assume that these spaces are often permanent, or place in them are permanent. This is an excavation I worked in Spain many years ago of an old temple and burial grounds, and up to 500 BC. And as you can see, everything ends up in a bag and often in the basement of a museum. So you can't assume that this is all permanent. So just a reminder. And that's it.
Thank you, Alex. Yes, so let's go on to Candace.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen. Can everybody see my screen? Yes, awesome. So I'm Candace, and I'm going to share a little bit about myself. So my journey is a little bit zigzagging, coming back and forth. So I started out as a storyteller. I started college with the dream to become a journalist. And after multiple opportunities abroad, I found my passions in city designs. And today I am an urban planner and a placemaker. So I've always been a believer that one's journey is hardly linear. So I use the skylines of different cities that means a lot to me and made this zigzaggy timeline of my journeys. And I think the topic today is no difference in terms of multi-facade meaning of cemetery as a place and as a mental state. So when Madeline first asked me to do this talk, I immediately thought about my family. The belief in my culture, which is Chinese culture, is that a family who passed away have always had and will always have a continued existence in our lives. So even after they passed away, we believe that there is a part of them that are still with us. So during Chinese New Year, the biggest celebration of the year, the Chinese equivalent of Thanksgiving, before the reunion dinner, we would invite the spirits of ancestors to join the celebration of the new year. We will present them with their favorite dishes, flowers, food, fruits, as if they are having a dinner with us. So the process of mourning, remembering, cemetery, in my opinion, I'd really like to think that it's a reunion with the past. So now I'm going to talk about a little bit about a project that I worked on along with Placemaking US. It's about Santa Ana Chinatown. So the Chinatown in Santa Ana was deliberately burnt down in 1906 in the wake of the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. So the town where all Chinese immigrants who came here as imported labor for farming and railroads building lived here, and it was reduced to a pile of ashes overnight. So it was quoted as the mediated act of malicious violence, civically sponsored vandalism. But because of the hate, which mirrors what is happening today with the anti-Asian issue in a time of COVID-19, these buildings where they lived in, their dwellings and all their belongings were burnt to ash. So it was rather a heartbreaking story to begin with, and guess what this place looked like today. You can't even imagine. It's becoming a parking lot today, like many other places in the US. And a community member, Dylan, reached out to Placemaking US and wanting to make this place into a site that honors its history. So I was very honored to be involved in this project, and we started to look at elements of traditional Chinese memorial architecture, along with my other teammate architect, Tina Govan. We were thinking about how to honor the history, how to provide a safe place for the Chinese communities and the families whose ancestors were impacted by this event. But we're also thinking in bringing those history and memories to life, what will this place mean for strangers? How do we imagine this place to interact with the passerby? So we take those elements and translated them into some designs, as you can see on the screen here. We wanted to harness the history. We use these designs and visualization as the first step to reach out to Chinese communities in Santa Ana. And we wanted to support local arts and encourage use of this place. Where we were thinking the cemetery, the memorial sites here is merely just that. It is also a public space and a cultural site. And now I'd like to take you to another example which inspires me throughout this design process, which is the Ancestor Cemetery in Copenhagen. So when you look at the pictures here, you really think how come cemetery can become such a peaceful and a public place, right? And the Swedish poet once quoted this place as so relaxing as one of the most beautiful graveyards in Europe. You can see the leafy trees, you can see the dark path, you can see the flower expanses, and the marble tombs overhang by the weeping willows. So all of these elements really transform this place of death into a little paradise. So the same question comes here. How do we harness the history of the place? How do we provide a safe place for the family? And what does a public space like cemetery means for strangers? I like to think that cemetery is a place of history. It fills the needs of the living while respecting the memory of the deceased. And it is often a place of unique features and green spaces. This is a cemetery in Boston with amazing lake and green features. And beyond that, a public cemetery is also a place where people mourn, people have conversations, people inspire each other and share thoughts and gather. And when we put that this way, it's really a public space, a park, and a cultural site. So I'd like to think that cemetery is really a celebration of hope, a celebration of life in memory of the lives that passed away, and a celebration of today, tomorrow, and togetherness. It is so cemetery isn't just a burial area, it is also a cultural site and public park. And when we design cemeteries, we really need to think about the multi-use of the site, how it encourages activities, and how we can think of it as a place for the living in the land of the dead. Thank you. I think that will be the end of my presentation.
Thank you so much, Candace. And thank you for sharing. Next, we'll go to Tim.
Hi, everyone. Such a gift to be here. Well, I think I got invited in part because I had an incredible meal with Ryan and Madeline a few months ago, talking about all kinds of things, about some things that my wife and I are up to in our neighborhood, and about the Parish Collective, which is a network of churches that are trying to organize their common life around the common good of particular neighborhoods. And somehow, I think in perhaps because Madeline was thinking about this, we started talking about cemeteries and death. And it struck me something I've heard long ago that I would maybe propose. And that is, while I'm of the kind of Christian tradition, that all spirituality, regardless of different religious faith, arguably is about learning how to die. And as Alex said at the front, I mean, we are obviously right now confronted with death over and over and over again. And while that's atrocious, and there's all kinds of implications for that, there might be some hidden gifts in this reality for us as well, because at least for me, when you begin to think about death, our own death, the fact that we will all die, there's something quite profound and powerful of how it strips away the things that matter, contested against the things that frankly don't matter that much. Like so many of you, my family, both my immediate family has had COVID, and we made it through, but it was very tricky, and my wife was pregnant, and there's all kinds of feelings and emotions around what in the world's going to happen. Just 2 weeks ago, I got on the first plane I've been on in what feels like 10 years, but has in about a year, because my parents, who are both over 65 and both have pre-existing conditions, both contacted COVID. And, you know, they're okay, but when we even entertain the idea of death, which I think our culture is in many ways kind of terrified of, and maybe understandably so, we might be kept from the things that matter most. So that's maybe where I would begin with this, in that I would kind of argue that we are all spiritual. We certainly are all going to die. And there's maybe a moment right now, as it relates to our places and how places evoke memory, that is a gift to be received right now. One of those things for me is that everywhere is actually sacred. There's this, every place is sacred. There's this beautiful quote that I've always loved by the essayist and poet and farmer Wendell Berry, who says that there are no unsacred places. There are only sacred places and desecrated places. And I think that it gives us something of an invitation to the topic of both race and place and also death and memory, because if you will kind of go with the idea, even just for a little bit, that everywhere is sacred, that it actually isn't particularly helpful to think of like the spiritual and material as though they're completely distinct and can't be connected, or sacred and secular. If you just entertain the idea that it's frankly all sacred, and then there are also lots and lots of places that have been deeply, deeply desecrated, I think that's an invitation for us to begin to think about race and racial categorization and racial trauma for all of us, because that is some of the most profound desecration that all of us continue to keep living with. Whether we're more on the side of the colonizer or the oppressed, we can all point to, and we've even seen examples of places that have been profoundly desecrated. So within this broader, just kind of, I'd pause here and say maybe two ideas. One, within the broader kind of movement of placemaking, of which I'm a card-carrying member, two invitations. One is to do an increasingly better job as best we can to name places that have been desecrated or that are being desecrated. We have to name it. We have to be honest. We have to tell the truth about it as best we possibly can, and from as many perspectives as we possibly can. But something sacred has been harmed, has been marred, and it's not right. I can't wait for you all to hear about Trin's work, who's doing that so powerfully through her art. I think this is such a gift to us. And the other thing, and this is something that we talked about earlier when we got to know each other last week, is in some ways kind of still a bit of I'm borrowing from the Christian tradition. It's certainly present within the Jewish tradition and arguably within all religious traditions, and that is one of lament. And that is when we have the courage to name and see what has been desecrated, what has been killed, what has died, what has been oppressed, what has been harmed throughout history or in our present day, that we wrestle through in our neighborhoods, in our villages, in our towns, in our suburbs. How do we collectively lament? I think that is a big question for us as a culture. And I think that placemaking has a really vital role to play in that. I think that some of the activity or the active, active to make a place active, yeah, we want to bring it to life. We all want that. But where there's been death, where there's been harm, I think we need to point to that too. And we need to invite others to share in it. Because as we're, I think, being reminded more and more and more in this cultural moment, there is no reconciliation without telling the truth. There is no reconciliation without reparation and naming what has happened. And to skip over it, as hard as it is, as painful as it is, scary as it is, it doesn't get any of us where we need to go. So I think that lament and naming the places that have been desecrated are increasingly important. Thanks.
Thank you, Tim. And now we'll go to Trin, Mai.
Sorry. Hi. Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be talking about this because it's like part of healing, right? I make a lot of different work, and a lot of it is to preserve my family history and the history of our people. My current work deals a lot with the history of Vietnamese America. Sorry about that, I live downtown. The history of the Vietnamese American people as I know it, from stories that have been passed on to me from my family and to those who have been so generous as to share their stories. And then speaking in the way that it just weaves itself into, oops, can you hear me okay? the way that it weaves itself into present day. So a lot of my work is, I use a lot of different mediums. And a lot of the work is about war and death and suffering. And so, sorry, I'm about to get emotional already. I didn't think it was going to happen so soon. But I look at my work and it just makes me so sad. And just thinking about what Tim said about lamenting, and just like, I was really thinking about just loss, right? So the loss of our loved ones, the loss of our country, the loss of our people, and then watching it continuing to happen in this devastating world. So this is some of the work I do. This is my husband's father. This is a photo that was taken of him while he was imprisoned in the re-education camp in Vietnam for 3 years. He was a general of the South Vietnamese army, so was tortured tremendously. And I use a lot of materials that help tell these stories. So those bullet wounds right there, those war wounds, there's 17 of them because he was shot 17 times and survived. So I took my tears and rainwater from Vietnam that a friend had brought back to me and rubbed them into, had this photo printed on a 4x6 foot piece of watercolor paper and rubbed my tears into them until it tore to recreate these war wounds. So in my mourning and in my honoring of these lives, I'm having to go through this process, which is extremely difficult. I never plan to do it, but I'm in prayer continuously. And there's just certain things that are revealed to me. So here's scripture, you can see right here. It said, this is torn from the Bible. And it said, blessed is the man who endures for when he has been, and then it just, we can kind of finish that sentence. And then thinking about these deaths, death and how out of these deaths, whatever that death is, there is like this great potential for growth, right? Whatever that is. And we just need to be faithful in that, because that's what's going to sustain us. Because the grief is overwhelming. So here you can see, these are copies of the paperwork from his release. And those are real plants right there that are sprouting from the wounds. So a lot of the work is about mourning. I actually didn't even realize that until this talk. And I was like, oh my goodness, what is this work? I'll just show you a few more photos. So this is a Vietnamese tradition here to wear white mourning bands for the dead. This is my great grandfather and his wife here, my great grandmother. This is from our family archive. And so I'm recreating these things. So these are mourning bands, and on each one, I've painted the portraits of those who went missing during the war in Vietnam. So that's something that I was thinking about when we think about these sacred spaces. Who do we ask for permission? And I don't know the answer to that, because is it for us or is it for the dead? And if we approach these things with honest hearts, is that enough? I would like to think so. So for all these people who had passed away, this is my uncle right here, who went missing. So these people were not given a proper burial. So I created the mourning sashes so that we could come together and mourn as a community. This is scale. So there's something about looking up, right, in reverence to these people. And sometimes some people bow their heads in prayer, but also there's a looking upward in prayer as well. These are sisters who went missing. They were 21 and 22 years old. And I retyped letters that their family members had written. They can be found at the Southeast Asian Archive and UCI, at UCI. And so I retyped the letters and then had to live through it as I did that. Here's the younger sister. Her mom wrote, "In the spirit of humanitarianism for the refugee people, please help us find our daughters." So thinking about grieving and what that is. And it's like, I was thinking about, you know, what Alex had said about, you know, there's this need to focus on the fun, celebrating life, which is, yes, also very important. But it's also very necessary to give ourselves time to grief. And it's a difficult task, and we want to kind of get that over with, which is something Tim also mentioned during our first meeting. But that grieving and that willingness to sit in that grief, what that confirms is the sanctity of life. And it's such an important process, but it's also such a difficult process. So yeah, it's hard to sit in that. And then thinking about what Tim also said about the sacred and the secular, and how can we live in that liminal space where we're honoring the sacred while recognizing our place in this world, this secular, this physical world, and just kind of living there. So that's really what my work is trying to do, living in this liminal space of spiritual and secular, past and present, and then just recognizing that I'm living history. So I'm like right in the middle of it all, and just really trying to make sense of that and honor those I love, because it's the way that I've been most effective in showing my love is making work about people. Because and thank you so much for allowing me to be here, because when I talk about them, when I talk about their stories, it keeps them alive, you know, it keeps them with us. And it's a responsibility that I feel like I have, and it can be very overwhelming, but it's also a privilege to be able to do that.
Thank you so much for sharing, Trin. And last but not least in this is Gordon Lee. And Gordon is actually one of the people who inspired this talk. I want to thank you for that.
All right, thank you. It was a great conversation when we first started talking. So and you know how it's kind of evolved to this panel, I feel is kind of amazing in its own way and its own process. So first of all, I really want to acknowledge all the previous panelists and what you've all said. You know, each one of you sharing your perspective and your story. Like honestly, I feel very moved, and I feel kind of, I don't know what the word is. I feel like everything each of you have said has resonated personally within me. For the purpose, I mean, I could talk about a lot of different things, but I guess for the purpose of this panel, I should just generally give kind of a little bit, a taste of the kind of projects I've been working on for the last, whatever, 10 plus years. And for lack of a better word, it really comes under this umbrella of what I have used and what some people have used as the term pilgrimage, which one I think wants to be very careful with in terms of how you understand and how you think about the word. I mean, the way that I've engaged in it really comes initially out of an annual pilgrimage that was done to Manzanar, which is in Southern California on the eastern side of the Sierras, which is a site, a historic site of where Japanese Americans were incarcerated during World War II. My understanding or my concept of pilgrimage is not the same as many other religious traditions, which I would totally respect, or I do totally respect, but I feel like needs to be somewhat distinguished. Pilgrimage in many respects tends to be a religious practice or religious ritual to go to specific sites for a specific purpose. Pilgrimage, as I've experienced it and as I have practiced it, is really about going to sites of specific historical memory for specific communities. For example, Manzanar is a specific site for the Japanese American community, specifically in California, but in the United States as a whole. Because that's where from 1942 to 1946, plus or minus, largely the entire Japanese American community on the West Coast was incarcerated. And the practice of going there, like many of you have already said, is to both reclaim the history, reclaim the experience, which was largely buried for many decades in the United States. Even within the Japanese American community, very few people talked about where the camp was, what happened in the camp, what was the extent of what people actually experienced in the camp. And even now, however many years later, what is it? 70 years later, after doing pilgrimages since 1969, what I find amazing about this experience of doing the pilgrimage and doing this kind of engagement is that not all the stories are present. It's like excavating layers and layers of lived experiences. And there's this slogan at the interpretive center at the Manzanar site, which says something like there were roughly 10,000 people incarcerated, probably a little bit more. For 10,000 people, there were 10,000 stories. And each person has a story. And of course, it is a collective story, but it's also an individual story because each person and each family experienced it somewhat differently. And I've been going since 2007. So that's roughly, 14 years. And every time I've gone on the pilgrimage to Manzanar, it's been different. It has not been the same. And one of the things I've found, and I think some of you have alluded to, is that when you do this kind of, I don't know what to call it, when you engage in these kind of acts or events or practices, whether it's Trin's art or Tim's talking about the lamenting or Candace is talking about creating these memorials, somehow something happens to both those of us who engage in it, as well as it feels like to the place itself. I mean, I don't know how to explain this, and it may sound funny to some of you and maybe to all of you, is that when you go to these places, or when I've gone to these places, it's like you begin, especially after going more than once, you begin to hear people talking to you. You begin to hear the voices of the spirits or of the ancestors. And I totally relate to Candace in terms of our Chinese tradition. I mean, I grew up not feeling very Chinese. I grew up feeling very assimilated. But over the years, I have slowly felt and become more conscious that some of my unconscious feelings and thoughts actually come from another place. They don't come from the context of the world that I grew up in. They come from the context of a different world that I come from. So I should kind of close it now, but I think what I'm trying to say is that the context of the work that I've done is, or the projects I've worked on is really, so there's Manzanar, we after going to Manzanar for several years, we started actually wanting to do a quote new pilgrimage, and that was to the Sacramento River Delta in California, which is to kind of honor the Chinese experience. And then after that, I landed up coming home to the island of Oahu in Hawaii, and I landed up doing this thing called Stations of the Cross, in a local neighborhood in the city of Honolulu. But all those things are like stories that will take more time. But the bottom line is kind of, what was I going to try to say, is that this practice that relates place, the topic is like place and cemeteries, but there's a lot of dots in between how you get from place to cemetery, at least for me. So it's like place initially was places of historical memory. the purpose of going to the places, like some of you have said, is that they are sacred places. But it's like, I don't know about the rest of you. I grew up in a world that was pretty like not sacred. So it's like to go to these places helped me to realize what it meant to be sacred. And so like learning and feeling the experiences of like my ancestors or other people's ancestors and what they experienced in these places, and how the memory and the reclaiming of these experiences meant something to us today, like me or the students that I took on these pilgrimages. It's like, it's not just learning about the past. It's like the past is somehow connected to the present. And then the other point is that this thing about personal and community or personal and collective. It's like, I don't know who was saying, I think maybe all of you are saying, it's like, yes, it's about me, but it's not only about me. It's also about you, and it's about we, whoever the we happens to be, and the we, I would argue, is a lot larger than we tend to think it is. Especially in the world that we live in now, the we's tend to be like, there's this we and that we and this we, and we don't like each other, or we don't understand each other, or we have issues with each other. And I will argue that as we do this kind of work of claiming historical memory, the we gets bigger. And we realize that we are related to each other. Like Tim's story, Tim's community, Trin's story, Trin's work, like our communities do get connected in this larger historical sense. But I think part of the problem is that the stories and the narratives that we are given or we are taught tends to make us more like isolated in smaller we. So I will end with that thought.
Thank you, Gordon. It's so interesting because there were so many different questions when we were discussing and began to this dialogue for this evening. And some of the things that were brought up was that we're actually in a period, and it's very timely for us to be discussing this because there is a mourning, the process of our country that's been going on because of COVID. We have like, what is the numbers, like 500,000 deaths already in February. We have a past presidency. We have an economy we have this loss of social space where all of us are shuttered indoors. We have, and it's interesting because as we were all talking, we were seeking sort of that thread that connects all of us and all of our work, and this place and the material that's imbued in the meaning of place. And we also are seeing these things like people tearing down old structures and rebuilding new structures. We have cities that have highways that have gone through the centers of them and torn up whole communities, where we want now to take the highway out and bring the community back. And there's so much happening. And I think it's a very pivotal moment for us to have these conversations, especially with folks that are designing our cities, designing our spaces, and thinking about our places, because the richness and the deep layers, as you're describing, where even our bones are embedded in the land. Like I've heard that New York City is Native American underneath the whole body of land, and we know that that's in all different places. And it's part of this is about also how do we reclaim that history as we continue to build to recreate the world. And I would love to just hear from each of you a little bit more about what you think of this. We can start with anyone who, maybe Candace, we'll go back to you since you started.
Yes, I'd be happy to share some thoughts in terms of placemaking, history, and this idea of cemetery. I think storytelling is very important when you're trying to create a place. You think about the past, what has happened on this land. You think about the present, how people is using the place, the public space that we're trying to design, and you think about the future. What kind of activities do we want to inspire? So it's a really complex, non-linear timeline we're talking about here. So in a various, you know, a placemaking project that I've been working on, it's a continuous balance of listening the needs of the current communities and using our expertise to design a place that honors the history, taking into the feedback from the community. So there's no one answer to this question, but it's rather a complicated one that requires a lot of empathy, sympathy, and understanding. So I'll leave it at that as that.
Can I add to that? Yeah, coming from a place, I totally feel what you're saying about like how it has to come from a place of empathy and sincerity. And I think one of the ways that we do that is to experience it first as us, going back to what Gordon was saying, and a lot of us were saying about having it be this collective experience, but also this very personal experience. If we could just like sit in it and experience it for ourselves and then offer it to the community as something, a lot of my work deals with that, right? I sit in a place and I mourn and I work with these materials and then I discover something. And then I'm going to show you pictures actually. Let's do that. And then I discover something and then I offer it as a way to invite people into that space. So 9. Okay, so this is very related to your piece or the photo that you had, Alex, in Oaxaca with the little niches and with the candles. So this was at San Diego Art Institute, and these are little tombs that we built into the wall. They started off as tombs actually, and then when we continued working on them, they became like nests for like new growth. They became little vaults for secrets. So this was a piece that spoke on the immigration situation and all those who have gone missing and died. And so these are sea stones that I collected from the coast, just thinking about how we're just made of this same stuff, right? We're made up of earth. This is sandstone with meta sandstone with quartz veins. And then all those little scrolls are contributions from community members. So I asked them to write about their fears, to confront this fear, right? Whether it's, fear of death or fear of not achieving what we want to achieve. I mean, we live, again, like living in this world where, and being human, there's all these fears, what is to come after death, right? So it was a project to where people could confront these fears, and surprisingly, and I promised not to read them, although when I would re-roll some of them, I would recognize words. The 3 words that most often came up was snakes, alone, and God. And then the 4th was death, which I found very interesting, that alone came before, or the ones that I noticed at least, the ones that I recognized. So that cotton that you see in the background there, that was actually that was plucked from the farm that my husband and his family worked on when they first came to America. My husband is Cambodian Vietnamese American. And so that speaks again on like loss of country, loss of freedom, and then gain of freedom. So here's people writing in the scrolls. This is kind of going back to offering, right? So like if we can sit in this and it really truly experience the weight of what this grief and death is, then when we offer it to the community, it becomes that much more sincere, and in doing so, it'll be done that much more in love. And that's so important, right? Because we have these ideas of what would be interesting or what would be cool or what does the community need? And it's very difficult, right? Because we'll always get pushback because different people need different things. So how do we appease everybody? I found that if we come from our own experience and offer it, then it seems to, I don't know, it just seems to be more effective as an offering rather than like a fixing or a mending, which we often do. So these here are, I worked with the IRC, and these are some of their peacemakers, and they are high school refugee students coming from 9 different countries. And here they are, like touching the scars on the walls here. They're bearing their fears and prayers. So I just wanted to add to what Candace was saying about that, like coming from a place of empathy, and how do we do that?
Madeline, I'm not sure what your question is. So I'm just going to kind of respond briefly. I personally feel like it's very difficult and challenging to address the question about like monuments, because we have a culture and a society that has created a lot of monuments in the framework of its own narrative. And for some of us, that narrative is not ours. It represents a narrative that they've told about us, or they want us to fit into. And it took me the longest time on a personal level. I mean, I spent the majority of my younger life trying to fit into those narratives. And it wasn't until later that I realized that that's not who I really was. And that's also not who the history really tells me. I mean, it's really not an accurate reflection of history, at least from my personal perspective. But you know, I believe, and I could be totally wrong, is that the question about the monuments raises this question socially and collectively and nationally about which narratives are going to be visible and which narratives are going to be invisible. You know, and like when I listen to Trin talk, I mean, honestly, Trin, I mean, you are totally an amazing person and what you do, but you're talking, for me, you're talking a lot about the non-visible narratives. You're talking about bringing to light the stories that we don't normally hear, you know, but that we carry with us personally and collectively, like all of our lives. And as a community psychologist, that's kind of the trauma and the pain, right? I mean, so we have all these symptoms that we carry and we manifest in the world, but many of us don't even know where those symptoms come from. So that's all related to this question about the monuments, you know, and so like people feel, but I totally acknowledge that people's feelings around the monuments are real, that they mean a lot to them, that, you know, for those of us who don't necessarily feel like I want to go around carrying a Confederate flag. I mean, yes, for some people that Confederate flag means a lot to them. At least they think it does. You know, and like how who was raising, I don't know if it was today or at the earlier meeting, you know, this idea of truth and reconciliation. I mean, I think one has to kind of at least ask that question. I mean, is it possible to have truth and reconciliation? You know, and I'm not, to be very honest with you and anyone who's listening to this, I am not personally that optimistic about how much truth everyone can handle and how much reconciliation we can really have at any particular point in time. Of course, I believe and I hope that, yes, it's possible in a kind of deeper way in the longer run. But in the immediate moment of, like, let's say today, or like, let's say today or next month or even this year, like how much truth and how much reconciliation can we have? You know, one of my colleagues suggested that with the monuments, We have one museum for one bunch of monuments, and we have another museum for another bunch of monuments. Or we have kind of spaces where you can have different monuments from different narratives. And the purpose is educational in a sense, you know. I mean, I guess it's more than educational, but it's more to help people become more aware of these things. So, and I don't even know if that's possible, but I mean, I guess that's my response to your question.
I really liked how you talk about visible and invisible thoughts. I think it is so true that different things appeal to different people, different places have different history and narratives. But as a placemaker, I think all the cemetery or all the memorials have one thing in common, is that it is thriving to be a peaceful environment that encourages both silence and inspires conversations. So we're always thinking about the human emotions, the invisible and the built environment, and how do we interact from this to that, and how do we encourage more of a peaceful environment while we inspire more thoughts and emotions. So I think that's a really interesting point that you two are bringing up.
It's also really interesting, and I mean, I know Tim had brought up something about what had just recently happened at the Capitol. And when you talk about narratives, it's really interesting to see, even in what happened months ago with the Black Lives Matter movement, and the recognition that maybe the story of the country even is still leaving out these narratives that are fighting in a way for recognition rather than being invisibilized. And it's just really interesting that all of this seems to be coming up at one time. But Alex, we haven't heard from you for a while.
I'm soaking it in. I too am skeptical about a lot. This has been a tough year. But if we are to start somewhere, we have to start with ourselves and where we're at. So I think the recognition that we have to meet people where they're at, and we have to recognize where we are ourselves as practitioners, I think is a really important point. The earlier conversation about empathy and what Trin was talking about us acknowledging our own role in these spaces, I think is critical. And it's a very important principle in community development that that we're not doing things for people, that we're not saving people, that we're not empowering people because people inherently have power, but that we are doing things with others. And when we look at it through the lens of culture or race, I think about the idea of solidarity and what that means. And that, yeah, we start with our individual stories and we share them and we see where that leads us.
Yeah, those individual stories are so intertwined. I mean, they're human stories. So it's like when we can when we can have that courage to share these very intimate stories, we're helping someone else tell their story, maybe, or opening up, softening their hearts or opening up the door to invite them to tell their stories. And I feel like that's why therapy can work, because people just want to talk and they want to kind of like purge all of the stuff, all of this stuff that we carry every day. And yeah, that is bringing the invisible into the visible. Like that's exactly what that is. Like all of these thoughts and these emotions that we that we have to deal with and wrestle with. And then when we can share them in whatever way, through spoken word, written word, artistic practice, whatever proactivity it takes, it's like, it's this, I keep thinking about that idea of responsibility, because it's like how we if we are responsible for those we love, then does that not also include those who we love who aren't here with us anymore? It's like so much, y'all. Thank you all for doing everything you do, because it's like so much work. It's like just so much to think about and to process. I have some items here. These are my best friend's ashes. These are Kelly's ashes that I have incorporated in some work. These are my grandfather's ashes that my grandmother, she actually put this kit together, and most of my family members didn't want to take it because they're superstitious. And I was like, I'll live with them. So she didn't give me permission to use them in the work. She said, let me think about it. And then she passed away. So asking for permission, she never gave it to me. So I haven't used it. These are her ashes that I have also used in some work. So I'm like using their physical, these are things that are precious to us, right? So we would keep them hidden. And that's very much like the work that we all do, right? Trying to bring these things to life, and what that is, and be willing to do that. I think that's like the hardest part of it, is to be willing to do it, and then to do it. That might be, it's also a daunting task, but it might be the easier part of the whole process.
Tim, I'm curious to hear what you're thinking.
Well, maybe like many of you, I'm swirling around and thinking about a whole lot of things. But perhaps top of mind, which I don't know if it's entirely coherent, is a question, maybe a reframing question that I'm asking myself, maybe on behalf of folks that are tuning in right now or who will watch later, and that is, what is the role of placemakers in cultivating, advocating, even fighting for truth and reconciliation? I think that's a big question. I totally get how hard it is. It also doesn't feel like something that we can or should avoid. And I also think that maybe one gift that we have, I think for most of us, is that inherent to being a placemaker is the love of a particular place. And I think it's the particularity that might be maybe one of the first threads that we could pull on, because at least for myself, the power, like one of the reasons that I think neighborhoods or parishes or places of common responsibility and belonging are so powerful is that we don't necessarily and almost always choose who's there, but we're saying we belong to each other anyway. So it's not fun, but it's it's powerful. And I think that might be a gift in the same way that it was, said earlier, like if there's, Gordon was saying this, if there are 10,000 people that were, egregiously kept where they were, and there's 10,000 stories, those all happen within particular places. And so as we try and pursue the possibility of truth and reconciliation within our places, if we can pull on the particular, I feel like that's just it's more of a human way of going about it. And the capacity to be empathetic, at least for me, feels so much stronger. There's I think it's some saint said, be kind, because everyone you encounter is engaged in a great battle. And that all gets played out within a very particular place. And so Yeah, that's something I'm wrestling with right now, I guess, is what's the role and responsibilities of placemakers in truth and reconciliation? And how can the particularity of our very unique places, and even like the particularity down to blocks, and obviously, yes, like actual, whether it be cemeteries or monuments or whatever, it just feels like, you know, great art, like you dig deeper and deep, like all great artists like dig. I mean, this is what Trin's showing us, you know, over and over again. She's digging into herself and her family, which takes immense courage, and yet it's the most universal thing. So I wonder about that, I guess, for our common work.
It's interesting because one of the things you reminded me of, like early philosophy, is that the one and the many, and holding the struggle of holding these two pieces, which how do we hold the one and the many at the same time, and uh, recognize that. And as cities and places become more culturally diverse, like our cities, as they become more culturally diverse, it's really interesting because, again, uh, there might have been like this common idea a long time ago of what place was, but now it's infinite because you have so many different communities that there's so many stories. And then how do you learn to honor all of the stories within that space, and even allow for a recreation to occur that kind of creates this bricolage or thing of community, where it's like there's more there, and that we do have many things to share with each other. And one of the last things I was thinking is, the very first time that I saw Dia de los Muertos was a long time after, well, it was a few years after my mom had passed away. And I was walking down 4th Street in Santa Ana, California, where a cultural group in the community every year had created this beautiful Noche de Altares celebration in our downtown. And it was so shocking to me to see the altars with things that people loved on them. And I remember discussing it actually with Ryan, and he said, yeah, it's like the mantle is brought out into the front. It's something that is very private normally in most people's homes, but it's actually brought into the public, so that we're now actually moving between private and public space, and at the same time getting in, like, to see into like another person's reality, and also even like the grief and celebration and all of it. It was so moving to me, and it made me remember all these different things about my mother. And I thought to myself, you know, I think that my mom had died right after 9/11, or right before 9/11, actually, the year before, and her birthday was September 10th. So for me to see this, it also reminded me, like, how do we as a nation learn to mourn? Because if we don't mourn, there isn't any kind of regeneration that can occur. Like, and it feels like, along with that kind of fear of death, we also have kind of shut out the fact that mourning is actually, it's a natural part of the whole process of life, grief, regeneration. And if you hold it away from you, then you're actually kind of developmentally delaying the ability to process at all.
I'm actually feeling a little more optimistic now. You know, I love this conversation because it's helping. I mean, it's not like something I don't know, but it's something I feel like I often don't remember, you know, and that's like, I forgot who said it. One of you said, like, you know, the story, I think Tim, the stories are really important, and the particularity of the place is really important. And if we can honor and share, quote, everyone, I mean, probably not everyone, but different stories of different people in the same space over different time, you know, maybe, just maybe, we'll actually begin to find this thing that I put in the chat about where are the threads of the we, you know, and maybe there are threads of a we that is not the ones that we know right now. Maybe there is a new we. And I don't mean to be overly idealistic or romantic, but I just feel like just maybe, if we just stick to the stories and we honor the stories, both the positive and the less so positive stories, and we try to create, maybe I don't know if this is a role for placemakers, but it's a role for someone, who can hold the space or the place where all these threads can be present and can be honored. And maybe, just maybe, if that's possible over a long enough period of time, that slowly these threads begin to intersect in new ways. And again, I don't want to be, I don't know. It's easy for sometimes, I think, for me to be, to come up with an idea and feel like, oh, this is a great idea. It's obviously, it's all, the proof is in the pudding. So it comes down to individual places and individual people and individual groups or organizations that want to and can, want to hold the space so that these stories can become present. But just maybe that's a direction, and maybe I love what you said, Tim, about, while truth and reconciliation may be hard, but we have to start somewhere. Yes, I totally agreed when you said that. I know it's hard, but yes, I agree. We do have to start somewhere. And maybe that's, if we, in a sense, I don't know who the we is, if we can agree that we have to start somewhere, and maybe it doesn't matter so much where we start, but that we start, and like whether it's Candace's projects or your projects in the parish or Trin's works of art or Alex's, the Dia de los Muertos. Maybe these are all different threads of a process that can begin doing what we're talking about.
Yeah, I completely agree with the particularity of single place and single story that always resonate with people. It's like Black Lives Matter. You don't have to be Black. You don't have to be of the same race to understand the trauma, to understand the feelings. You don't have to live through the same thing, but you understand, you resonate. Why? Like I see Trem I's work in an art museum, or I see someone's grave in their resting place. I resonate with it. What is it? Is it place? Is it space? Is it the air? Is it the massing of the architecture? Perhaps it's just a piece of stone, a particular white cloth, a piece, a flower, something about the place of object and the storytelling will always resonate with people. So I really think, as a placemaker myself, when we design places, we need to think of activities, like basic activities people do, like sitting, walking, resting, but we also need to design places that allows for people to feel, allow flexibility of events that you won't even think of when you first designed the place. Maybe some person resonate with this place and they stand there for hours because this mourning process that the storyteller wants us to engage with makes him think of something. So it's really important to value the particularity of one single story and tell that story straight in a way that resonates with the people.
Places where people feel. That was a very powerful statement. And it makes you wonder, like, when did we ever stop making places about human feeling? Because to have a living city means that everywhere we go, those impressions are made upon us. There is feeling. Anyway, we have like around 10 minutes or so left. I'd love each person to go through and just like give kind of what encapsulates where you are right now with this dialogue and share your final thoughts, essentially. I don't know who wants to start. Maybe Alex? I don't, or
Sure, I'm not ready, but I'll do it. Final thoughts. I'm thinking about trauma. I've been exploring trauma a lot personally in my life with my therapist. Actually, it was a very trauma-informed approach. I'm thinking about trauma. I'm thinking about 9/11. I'm thinking about our current political situation. Thinking about the way some people have responded and what the implications of skipping over grieving and lamenting. That when you just jump to revenge or scapegoating, you know, what harm that can cause. And I'm also just thinking about we've lost a lot of people, but we've also lost a lot of places. And I'm thinking about how we're going to mourn those places, because some of those will never come back. So that's where I'm at right now. And very appreciative of all of you.
Gordon, do you want to share? We'll go back across.
Sure. I mean, I'm just kind of processing and resonating with what Alex said. I mean, I love these two thoughts, these two threads. I mean, Candace's thing about the place and the feeling of place, and Alex's thing about the loss of place. I mean, yes. I mean, it's something. It's helpful to feel, to be conscious of that place is also like a living thing, and that we can lose place, and place can die. I mean, just like people can die, places die. I mean, and I know that it's a little bit, I don't know what the word is. It's a little bit like yes and no. I mean, yes, they do die, and yes, they don't die. You know, it's like, but places do die, and yet, how do I say this? I don't know how to say this very well. It's like, you know, it's like cultural memory, social memory, place memory. It can die, but it can also be renewed and remembered. So like, I don't think that death is a final death. That kind of death doesn't have a human sense of finality, if that makes any sense to any of us. You know, it's just like, what is my example? It's like the indigenous language of this island. So Native Hawaiian or Kanaka Maoli or Olelo Hawaii, you know, it like died. It died. It died from colonization. It died from capitalism. You know, it was replaced with the English language, which I had to learn growing up as a young child. So, but my grandmother was fluent in Kanaka Maoli, and she was not ancestrally Hawaiian. She was ancestrally Chinese, but she spoke Hawaiian language better than she spoke English. You know, so, but that language in the last, what, 30 years has been renewed and revived. So it has come back to life, and more people speak Olelo Hawaii now than they did 30 years ago on this island. So I'm just saying, I'm just saying these threads about place. And for those of us who, honestly, I haven't considered myself a placemaker before. I think I will now. You know, it's like, I love this idea of placemaking. And I don't exactly know what it all involves. But based on what those of you here who have said about it, I feel like it's something I've been doing already without having a name for it. So it's like, for those of us who want or who are placemakers, you know, like I feel like tonight or today, we've begun to explore something that's alive. And it's a beginning and it's not an end. That's my thought.
Trin.
Yeah, I've been working with Bing Yang, a photographer, and he goes back to well, he's taken these beautiful photos of Pulau Bidong, the refugee camp where his family arrived in Cambodia. And he had said during one of our talks together, he had said, these places absorb history. So it's really interesting to talk about the death of history of like certain, you know, places, but really it's all absorbed. So all of these stories exist therein, which is like a little overwhelming because it's like, okay, now how do we deal with that? So which stories are we trying to unearth, and then which stories are we trying to contribute, which is like a huge task. But I love, and I try to live by this because it's the only way I can manage like my life and the world around me. But the thought of starting with ourselves, because when we do that, it's just like there's a way in which it just organically expands to us, right? It starts with my work, my feelings, my shortcomings, my struggles, you know, my life. And then it begins expanding, right, into this ours, like our life. Wait, I'm one of a whole. Oh yeah, that's right. But there's something that happens there that I'm really interested in. And it always starts with me. So I do feel very selfish when I start working, right? Because I'm trying to figure out why I need to make this thing or what story I'm trying to tell. But then it's like, well, who am I really telling it for? It's not for me because I know the story. So yeah, there's something about that I really need to come back to. So thank you all for the reminder of that. Do I have time to show just like one piece? I have my list here, so I know where to go. Title 13. Okay, so this is a portrait. It's a life-size portrait of my husband, and it has to do again with those who have died during this immigration crisis. So loss of freedom, loss of country first, loss of freedom. And as I was working on this, so there's a pile of dirt there coming from the garlic farms on which they toiled when they first came to America, being paid $1 a bucket. So now this story, this is Hien's family's story. This is the Cambodian Vietnamese American story, but it's also so many other people's stories. I mean, they worked alongside these immigrant farmers and didn't speak the same language, but were able to communicate and take care of one another and trade vegetables. And he had a Mexican family of 5 living with his family of 6, 11 people living in a 2-bedroom apartment, and nobody spoke a common language, but they lived together for almost a year, and the women would cook together. And so it's like, it starts with this very personal thing, and then it expands, and the work that we do will naturally lend itself to that. That's a Cambodian, on his shoulder there is a silver-breasted broadbill, which is native of Cambodia. And then that's an American goldfinch that's right there on his head. There's a close-up of that. So, okay, so these arrows, this project was actually inspired by Psalm 91 that says, "Thou shalt not be afraid for the arrow, for the terror by night," because that's when the ice raids, most of them happen, is during the still of the night when we're most vulnerable, nor for the arrow that flieth by day. And then it continues and it says, 1,000 shall fall at thy side and 10,000 at thy right hand, but it shall not come nigh thee. So it's like this prayer of protection. And thinking about the thousands of people. So when I read that, I thought, oh, they're arrows. The arrows are missing us, right? So it's like, we are the lucky ones. We are still standing. And so we've taken on this duty to bring about these places for the living and the dead, right? So the people we want to honor. And Hien, when he read the 1,000, he was like, no, those are people. The 1,000, the 10,000s are people who have died. So as I was making these arrows, I did all this research and wanted to craft them using indigenous methods, right? So it took me weeks to try to figure out, because fletching them is not an easy chore. And they're all made with like found objects. So found branches that I sanded and whittled, found feathers. These are actually from Orange County, which holds the largest population of Vietnamese Americans outside of Vietnam. And using wax and found string, everything found. And so as I was making them, I was like, oh my goodness, this pays homage to the natives who had suffered through this mass genocide. And so those things happen as we're working, right? Like it starts with our own story, and then all of a sudden there's more to it. And it kind of adds on to what Gordon was saying about there's an owl that I found, death again, being resurrected into life. I needed more feathers, and so I prayed for feathers. And that day, actually, we found this owl on the side of the road, who is actually a permanent resident of the United States, the great horned owl. And so I made feathers, or I made these arrows. But going back to the history of things, and having this need to honor that history, but it just kind of like accumulates as we work, right? So when we work wholeheartedly and in sincerity and in love, there's all these little pieces that come together that tell us, that show us what it is that we're really trying to do. Because I mean, I'm a clumsy creature. I don't really know. I'm just kind of fiddling around with materials. We're trying to find our way, but there's something transcendent that happens. Sorry, I just kind of went on a rant there. But yeah, it's like we're co-creating here, I guess, is what it is, right? Like being one of the whole and co-creating, even though we think we're the ones with the task, it's actually happening all around us, and it's just kind of coming together to help us do what we're supposed to be doing. So thank you all for doing what you do. Thank you so much.
The task has us.
Yeah.
Tim, did you want to?
Wow, that's so beautiful. Maybe just really briefly, what I'm thinking about is that one thing that I'm hearing a bit as a theme that maybe has been said and unsaid is that the hope that we have largely depends on the love of our places and the people that have always been there. And I think that might sound a bit cliche, but that is how we have to, lean into anything that's conceivably hopeful. And to give it a little bit more of a contrast, I've been so grateful for this conversation. It's been so resonant. It's also probably worth saying that there are competing narratives, right? There are competing stories with our places that are not rooted in love, that are not rooted in particularity. And that's part of why I think we have to fight for this. I think it's why we have to cling to it. It's why we have to say, no, this is worth fighting for. Our futures are at stake, because indeed they are. So yeah, I'm so grateful to be a part of this conversation. It's a real gift.
Thank you. Candace.
Where I'm at right now is a lot of thoughts. I guess the most the thought that comes to my mind the most is the importance of capturing the unique stories. It's the sameness of place that doesn't inspire. Like copying someone's else's work, helping someone else's story, copying someone else's design of place isn't going to inspire. We have to honor the uniqueness of individuals, and only when we truly value the individual stories will we understand the stories of the many. It's actually really interesting because this is a very heavy topic, race and place cemetery talk, but somehow by having this conversation with you all, I'm finally breathing for the first time in a very long time, because we don't talk about death, we don't talk about mourning enough. Even in the time of COVID-19, we don't talk about death enough. And just by hearing your work, hearing your feelings, hearing your stories and personal interactions about death and mourning, and speaking about this topic, I feel I'm breathing, I am alive, and I am so grateful for that. So resonate with a lot of the panelists' speech. I think places can die, they can regenerate, but stories will never die so long as we continue to honor them. And I feel this responsibility, as Trema was saying, we have to keep the conversation going, we have to keep the story going and never let them die. And that's the only way we can honor the history and what is happening right now. So thank you for having me, and thank you all.
Thank you. And the one thing that I have to say that I love so much is that I feel that you know that you've had a good dialogue with a group of people when it's generative, and there's something so generative and there's so much more coming out of this. And I hope that everyone who's been able to hear and listen, it helps them to deepen their practice. If they are placemakers, if they are folks who are just looking for ways to actually understand, because I think there is a lot more questions than there are answers, but I think we definitely have to have the dialogue. And thank you all for being wonderful dialogicians, if that's the word. And I hope to meet all of you again in some space. And I hope that your work also gets to be in all of these places, because we could actually work with Trin on that United Streets project in Santa Ana. And and we can, I mean, these are great. And this is the amazing thing about connection, because we can begin to build this as we are all describing and make it manifest. So thank you so much for being here, and we can all keep in touch. And please, any thoughts you have afterwards, please write and share, because we'll be wanting to know.